as right now the world continues to watch the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Based on the latest report, Vladimir Putin has not backed up yet. So in other words, he is gearing forward towards occupation in Ukraine. And meanwhile, the reactions from the international communities are rather diverse. As we are watching this tension, another part of the world somehow got looped into the conversation, which is Taiwan. As an international journalist, I used to travel between Taiwan and mainland China. It's so interesting that people in Taiwan, if I can use the phrase, is called rather anxious and watchful towards the tension between Ukraine and Russia. So that's why today it's so important. In this episode, I want to talk to our special guest regarding the tension between Taiwan and mainland China and why Taiwan at this moment should be watchful regarding the conflict in another part of the world. Join our show today, it's Brian Hioe, and he's one of the founding editors of New Bloom, and he's a freelance journalist as well as a translator. And New Bloom is an online magazine uncovering activism and youth politics in Taiwan and the Asia Pacific, and it was founded in Taiwan in 2014 in the wake of the Sunflower Movement. Brian, welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure to be on.
Absolutely, the pleasure is mine. Now, Brian, let's get started. As I mentioned in the intro, the whole world is paying attention regarding the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I want to know, the first question is, how do people in Taiwan react to this conflict and why it is so concerning to the Taiwanese people?
So it's quite interesting because there are a number of parallels that could be drawn between Taiwan and Ukraine. There are also a number of differences. But I think a lot of the discourse then, the concern is annexation of Ukraine by Russia would be similar to what would happen in the event of a Chinese invasion. And so in this sense, I think there is this concern. There's observations as to the effects of international sanctions, because, for example, if China were to invade, perhaps this repertoire would also be deployed against China. Similarly, with regards to the ability of Ukraine to stand up to Russia, I think there's a lot of watching and waiting in the hopes that if Ukraine can triumph in its struggle against Russia, this is a sign that smaller, weaker countries can actually stand up to larger aggressors. I think the parallels between Russia and China at this point are quite evident regarding claims on other territories, claims of historical ties, that another territory does not meet the qualifications for nationhood, and so that armed invasion is necessary and justified.
Well, Brian, but not too long ago, and to be more precise, 2 days ago, that the foreign minister of Chinese government and came out to say, and if I can paraphrase it, the issue between Russia and Ukraine and comparing with China and Taiwan are completely irrelevant. So in other words, during the press conference, he was saying that Ukraine and Russia has been dealing with each other politically and culturally for decades. But the tension or the issue regarding Taiwan and China have no way to compare with the tensions between those two former countries. So in other words, we shouldn't mix them together. Now, from your standpoint, what is your reaction to this? Now, again, why do you think that Chinese government is trying to distance themselves away from the tension between Russia and Ukraine when we talk about Taiwan and China?
So I think it's quite interesting because of the fact that China does not want to alienate the international community to the extent that it would if it just jumped on board with backing Russia. This is draw parallels to the Cold War. There's been a lot of discussion of the new Cold War, quote unquote, in the past few years. However, China would still lose a lot of international standing that it does not hope to. For example, with the recent Beijing Olympics, that's another sign of how China would like to have engagement. It would like to win the respect of the international community. You see these efforts of One Belt, One Road with outreach to Southeast Asian countries as well. And so I think then throwing your cards in with Russia, that might not be the right move there. But I think then it is inconvenient that there are these obvious parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan. The way that Russia justifies its claims over Ukraine are quite similar to how it justifies its claims over Taiwan, whether in terms of shared language, cultural heritage, the presence of for example, a small minority there, etc. And so that parallel, it does come up. It is a little inconvenient, too, that Russia's discourse for justifying why it's taking action against Ukraine, that, for example, recognizes the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk as republics, but does not recognize the Ukraine, that's a little confusing for China too, because in the sense that it cannot fully invalidate the principle of self-determination there when Russia is claiming to uphold that for these republics, but not for Ukraine. And so I think it's also more complicated there. And I think China wants to avoid this complication. So it wants to distance Ukraine and Taiwan in the popular imagination.
Well, but Ryan, we know that this year for China, and not only, as you mentioned before, quickly wrap up this Winter Olympic. And of course, that China today, in terms of understanding the tension between Ukraine and Russia, China is actually caught in the middle. And we know that Vladimir Putin, before this whole occupation, what we call the invasion, took place, Vladimir Putin had sent no signal to the world. And even though he made an empty promise that he was not going to do it. Now, the question drawing back to Taiwan, China for centuries and has been dealing with, this part of the world. And for years, that people, especially within this international community, has predicted that either there's going to be a conflict, or militarily, or culturally, politically, or China is going to be a bit busy with any other international projects, such as Belt and Road Initiative. But I think the question to you right now is, why do you think that China, again, hypothetically, what would China gain if China decided to take any actions against Taiwan? And also, don't you think that in the midst of the whole pandemic, or in the midst of the whole international globalization, if China decides to take such action, it is going to backlash, or it is going to create such a negative image for the country, don't you think?
Absolutely. So I think the rationale for justifying Taiwan is not actually, there's not a great rationale for that. It would be an illogical move because, for example, you'd be sacrificing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of human lives. Some of the estimates go up to 500,000. This would be the largest naval invasion since D-Day, which did not actually involve that many people, not more than 200,000 per se. And so then you lose that amount of people. That's going to create a political impact. For example, Russia, their losses are already creating backlash within Russia, but it's not anywhere near that amount that China would hypothetically lose. The Taiwanese economy itself is large enough that effects on it would cause ripples throughout the world. Their economy is larger than Greece, for example. We saw the financial impact from the Greek economic crisis. Then China's own economy is deeply interlinked with Taiwan in terms of semiconductor manufacturing, but other trade ties as well. And the economy is already slowing before COVID. And so then that effect on China's economy might not necessarily work out as well. And so then you are risking extreme crisis if you do that. So you are only doing this at your own peril. But what might drive China then in this sense is abstract nationalism, or just desire for imperial conquest, being willing to take that risk to justify future expansion, wanting Taiwan for its strategic value, the island belts, for example, around Taiwan, just expanding outward from Taiwan to other parts of the Asia Pacific. And that might make it a suitable staging ground. And so this what might China wants to have by taking over Taiwan. But in the near term, it does not seem a very rational move to do so. That being said, if China does act rationally, that could still happen.
And it's so interesting that when you mention technological aspect, and we're going to get to that in a second in terms of the competition in technology. But Brian, I want to ask you, since you are based in Taiwan, and let's go back to the people in Taiwan, just in a general sense, let me simplify the question. Are people fearful about mainland China today? And if so, what will be the reason? Because remember that Chinese leader Xi Jinping has been known for this poker face. Has been known that for strategic planning behind the doors. So it is rather difficult to know what this leader is going to implement in terms of dealing with international communities, or dealing with allies, or with friends. But meanwhile, I want to know that based on your observation, what is the reaction from Taiwan to the leader in mainland China, and what do people say regarding this leader? And especially this year, it's so critical that coming up to 10-year anniversary for Belt and Road Initiative.
So this is a part of what I was gesturing towards earlier, but I think this is why there's good reason to be cautious of Xi Jinping. In particular, he is centralizing power in his hands. For example, he wants to have perhaps lifetime rule. He has already abolished the term limits that a Chinese president can serve. And so if you do want to expand your power further, sometimes manufacturing crisis is the easiest way to do that. And one way to do that would be to attack Taiwan. And then there's the further danger of the fact that when you have decision making centralized in one person's hands, and perhaps this is what we also see with Russia, that person may not be behaving irrationally. They may be behaving irrationally. The party is obviously not a democracy, but it is still more than one person. And so more than one person making decision making, you have wisdom of the crowd. People can weigh into each other account and balance things out. That's not happening with perhaps one person who might not be acting rationally or is pursuing their own ends that are not those of his nation. And so in that sense, then people in Taiwan, I think, are afraid. They are cautious of Xi Jinping. They've seen the downturn that's happened in democratic freedoms that's occurred under his rule, the mass detention of Uyghurs, for example. Just even with the Beijing Olympics, there are several incidents that really called into question China's claims that it is democratic. And so there's that. But I don't think people are freaking out just yet in the sense that it's not perceived as an immediate short-term threat, because it is not. For one, troops massing on the shores of China would be detected ahead of time through satellite imagery. The air incursions, for example, that China launched against Taiwan have increased to such frequency that they sometimes occur on a near daily basis now. This did not actually provoke a lot of panic in Taiwan because they still occur far from Taiwan. Everyday life goes on, and etc. It's still a threat that is in the back of people's heads. Taiwan has dealt with Chinese threats for decades, and so that is part of why people are quite used to it.
You know, Brian, the former Secretary of the State, Mike Pompeo, paid a visit to Taiwan recently, and of course, which caused a huge alarm to mainland China. Some people say the purpose for Pompeo to make the visit because he was preparing for this 2024 presidential run and sending this message to China, and that can really boost his credibility in terms of the foreign policy side. But on the other hand, also, people claim that Pompeo's visit to reassurance that this partnership or this strategic alliance between U.S. and Taiwan. Now, from your perspective, how significant was Pompeo's visit to the U.S. and what was the general reaction from the Taiwanese government to receive such a credible and a reliable partner, which for centuries that this person has been claiming that Taiwan should be partner or close allies with U.S. because U.S. is going to provide resources to Taiwan technologically, politically, or maybe in the future, in other areas, Brian?
So it's interesting because Pompeo's visit was as a private citizen. He was not representing the U.S. government. And so in this sense, his move in visiting Taiwan was probably aimed at gearing up for a future presidential run. This indicates the amount of support for Taiwan among a certain wing of particularly Republicans does not reflect U.S. government policy. And so more significant as a former assurance was the defense delegation of former defense officials that the Biden administration dispatched to Taiwan, both Democrat and Republican. It was bipartisan in nature, but it came from the administration. And so this occurred in response to the Ukraine crisis. It was a way to reassure of ties after the Ukraine crisis. But I think what is particularly interesting to note about the Pompeo visit is that the Tsai administration really rolled out the red carpet. Taipei 101, the tallest skyscraper in Taiwan, lit up with a message of welcome for Pompeo. And so this was to show that Taiwan is banking on this wing of the Republican Party in some sense, I think. Just hedging bets in case that, for example, that wing of the Republican Party or the right wing or Pompeo and his allies come to power. But also as a way to pressure the Biden administration. It is quite significant that Pompeo did receive pay from the Tsai administration for the visit. Also, his messaging was very on point with what the Tsai administration is arguing, that it is not pushing for independence, that Taiwan is already independent by the name of the ROC. And that seems like a bit more than coincidence. And so I think this was also intended as a way to pressure Biden.
Brian, let's talk about the younger generations. Again, you are the part of the new online magazine. It's called A New Bloom. Now, I want to ask you, when we look at the millennials today, just across the world, younger generations are very bold, if I can use that word, in terms of engaging the political shifts, cultural movements, especially that these days, specifically in the region of Asia. So I want to ask you, is in Taiwan, how do the younger generations participate in such a political or cultural movement? And again, you mentioned this whole online magazine was inspired under this sunflower movement. So if you can quickly help us to recap, what was the sunflower movement about and why to create this online platform called A New Bloom, which I visited many times, and the insights and also the content was very creative and insightful. Can you share with us a little bit?
Thank you. New Bloom was started in 2014 during the Sunflower Movement that involved the youth-led occupation of the Taiwanese legislature by student activists. That was in protest of a trade deal that was to be signed with China, the CSSTA, which have also allowed for investment in Taiwan's service sector industry. It would fear that this would lead to a deterioration of democratic freedoms in Taiwan when there are already impacts from investment in the media, for example, by pro-China businessmen and that sort of thing. And so that would involve the occupation of the legislature for months. That mobilized at its peak 500,000 into the streets of Taipei, which is like 2.5% of the Taiwanese population. So I was a participant in that movement. And New Bloom magazine, which I founded along with my other cohort, we were also participants in the occupation itself, in the action around it, or organizing solidarity from abroad. And so it's been about 8 years since then, 8 years actually not too long from now, just in a little over a week. And so we were still doing this after all this time because we felt there was a need to really connect Taiwan in the international world. And so I think particularly in the years after the Sunflower Movement, there's been a sea change in Taiwanese politics. It is currently the DPP, the more progressive but also more independence-leaning party that is currently in power, and not the KMT, which was in power during the Sunflower Movement, but is the more pro-China and more conservative party. And so that has been a change. You have a generation of young people that have entered politics, now run as politicians that are in elected office, people that once occupied the legislature in protest of the trade deal, now sit in the legislature as elected officials. And so even now, when I go out, even just about today when I was getting breakfast, I would see a billboard of my friend who is now a city councilor in the area, for example.
Wow.
Or I might be running a city bus, and it's the billboard on the bus is of my friend. So it's a bit uncanny in some sense, but there has been this real entrance of young people into politics in this way in the past, effectively, decade.
But why do you think that younger generations today are very active in joining this political movement? I mean, Ryan, again, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that younger generations are not ready for such bold and risky venture. But I do want to say that, we always say dealing with political aspects or becoming a politician that does not just need the boldness and the brevity, that really involve a lot more strategic planning and the far-sightedness, in terms of the vision. So I want to know is why do the younger generations in Taiwan to activate and to participate such political movement? And meanwhile, because this is such how can I say, it's a growing region of the world, right? So in other words, how do we know that the younger generation's voice can be heard or will be more effective in the long run?
So I think it's an interesting thing, too, about the Sunflower Movement and the Sunflower generation, that after watching these elected politicians in office fail to accomplish things, to fail to really take into account the voices of the common people in their policy, young people decided to take matters into their own hands by occupying the legislature. One of the protest slogans at the time was, "Save your own country." And so I think that is what happened after the young people running for office, feeling that, well, we had done this movement, we had occupied the legislature, we had organized this massive thing that really shook Taiwanese society. Well, the next step is to take that energy from this movement and translate it into something more firmer and more sustained, and that translate into the wave of younger people running for office. And so I think it is actually true that younger people are not in the positions where they actually hold power now. Tsai Ing-wen, for example, still was elected, but she positioned herself as a candidate with the support of young people and really depicted herself as such. But it is still the older politicians that are holding leadership positions in the DPP. But I think then there is dialogue between younger and older politicians in electoral politics and beyond regarding this. And I think also just this older generation, a lot of them themselves, some of these elected politicians that are more, let's say, progressive or what have you, did themselves participate in social movements when they were young. There's this pattern of social movement activists running for offices in Taiwan. And I think they also know in some sense they need to train successors, carry on this kind of history of democratic activism. And so I think that there is a kind of balance there. And so I think this is part of what is beyond this, behind this entrance of young people into politics.
And what about, Brian, the younger generations, their attitude towards the current leader, Tsai Ing-wen? And, from the social media perspective, that, for years that as I used to live in Taiwan and travel extensively throughout Asia, I would say among the international communities, the people are very much familiar with the leader of Taiwan. And, people have been praising and talking about how confident she appears and also how much effort that she devoted herself into build this alliance, across the parties. But again, we're looking at 2022. And again, just at the conversation we started at the beginning, the tension between Taiwan and mainland China is not going anywhere soon. But meanwhile, we have not heard, or we have not at least recently read anything regarding from Taiwan's government that her attitude and her leadership towards this whole tension between mainland China and Taiwan, and also the tension between Ukraine and Russia. So I want to know, like, how do people in Taiwan, especially the millennials, see the leadership or view the leadership under Tsai Ing-wen?
So I think young people in particular are quite satisfied. I mean, they are. That I think attract the attention and support of young people is why she embraced a progressive social policy, because she herself is a little technocratic and bureaucratic as a politician. She's not really a politician that really riles up the crowd, but she is quite strong on policy. And I think that has also played to her strengths in terms of cross-strait relations. China always frames her as provocateur in the way that her predecessor as DPP President Chen Shui-bian was often perceived as being. And this led Chen Shui-bian to lose the support of the U.S., or to have a great deal of caution towards him. And Tsai also experiences herself in the sense that the U.S. was originally quite cautious against her, feeling that she would be another DPP leader that would just become another Chen, another troublemaker in the region. And so embracing a very moderate image, saying that she is not pro-independence, but that Taiwan is already independent by the name of the ROC. There's no need to declare independence, being pro to status quo, but also being progressive on these issues. That's really worked to her benefit, I think, in that she was able to avoid losing support. And I think this is why young people support her in that sense. I think also it helps that she has a clean political image. She's seen as not corrupt, whereas the end of the Chen administration was marked by some corruption charges. And so I think that's another reason why people think that she's a break from the traditional politics, or at least does represent something closer to the voice of young people. And in the future, perhaps it will be young people, this current generation, that is in power. But until then, Tsai does seem like an adequate or capable leader, particularly to many millennials.
Brian, let's talk about technological aspects. As you mentioned before, right now in China, despite this economic growth, but meanwhile, we know it's crystal clear that the technological advancement in China has been lagging behind, and which is very concerning to the Chinese government. You know, for centuries that China has been in this competitive mood in terms of developing, chips or semiconductor, whatsoever, or artificial intelligence, however you call it. But again, China still has a long way to go in terms of competing, actually get on the same level with other countries, especially with the West Hemisphere. Now, from your perspective, how would you evaluate this whole technological growth of mainland China? And second, what about the aspect in Taiwan? Do you think that Taiwan right now has more advantages in this area in terms of competing with mainland China?
I think it's a factor there where, particularly in a lot of Western media discourse, there's a playing up of China as this kind of technological superpowers as overpassed the US. I don't think that's the case, because particularly if you look at the differences between a tier 1 and a tier 3 city, the differences are quite massive. And in that sense, the rollout of technology in China is quite uneven. China does have a lot of capital, it has a lot of people, there's a lot of talent there. And so this makes it very difficult for Taiwan, which is by nature many, many times smaller, to compete. Taiwan does have some advantages because development started earlier and so forth. Development was in the beginning, it did outpace China. But in that sense, there are still areas in which China is still dependent on Taiwan, particularly in the field of semiconductor manufacturing. Although the Taiwanese government denies this, some reports even state that the missiles pointed at Taiwan from China even contain Taiwanese semiconductors. And so that's quite interesting. China has made efforts to win over Taiwanese young people to China to work there, to form companies and get involved in startups and so forth. To some extent, it has been successful because pay in Taiwan is much lower compared to China. China is a larger market at the end of the day. However, I think that there is this concern among young people regarding the future of Taiwan, and that it does pertain even to the people that work in China. There are plenty of people that work there but preserve their own views regarding Taiwan or China. And I think in that sense, then the tensions between the U.S. and China, sometimes one frame of looking at it is a technological war, not just a trade war, etc., or just the fear of a rising power by a dominant power. That it is the struggle between these two superpowers for the key technologies that will dominate the next century. And so Taiwan is caught between the two insofar as it provides, for example, semiconductors to both the US and China. It is at the nexus of this technology war in that sense. And so I think that's one way of looking at this.
Brian, in terms of political alliance, how much can Taiwanese government trust the US? Because from one side, again, I talked to the experts within international communities. Some say that Taiwan should not solely rely on the US. And given this condition or the fact that right now under the current administration, domestic policy, it's a chaos. And let alone this foreign policy. And on the other hand, people say US is still very much interested in defending or, quote, protecting this part of the world. So from your perspective, again, you are a journalist and you are based in Taiwan. So the question, very simple. How much should Taiwanese government trust the U.S. in terms of defending itself, building military alliance, and also to build this sovereignty? What do you think?
I think for better or worse, the tendency will be towards self-reliance. Taiwan is still very dependent on the U.S. militarily, strongest economy. Also, the parts for the Taiwanese military equipment is often still from the U.S. But that is not going to change in the short term or immediate term. However, I think the broader tendency in the world, even if the Trump administration was very supportive of Taiwan, it was quite unstable regarding many decisions. It would flip-flop, particularly back and forth in messaging. Before Trump actually took office in a role that actually took place before he took office. Before the Trump-Tsai phone call, there was a lot of anxiety after Trump's victory that this would actually reflect a downturn in U.S.-Taiwan relations because Trump was seen as a wild card. That did not work out. That went the other way instead as tensions rose with China, and Taiwan inadvertently benefited from that. However, there's still that fear, and I think that there's not an illusion about the Trump administration, and that continues under Biden. There's a long-standing perception in Taiwan that Republicans are more supportive of Taiwan. The Democrats, for example, under Obama, had really thrown Taiwan on the bus. Tsai Ing-wen herself, in her 2012 presidential run, this was sabotaged by a call to the Financial Times from the White House, stating that the U.S. did not have faith in Tsai Ing-wen to stand up to China. And so Tsai herself has experienced what happens when the U.S. does turn on her. But at the end of the day, the relation with the U.S. is a fundamental bedrock of regional stability, and this is also not going to change immediately. So I think the Tsai administration is accommodating for that. I think particularly actions such as the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan that created domestic shocks in the sense that there's a fear that the U.S. might abandon its allies in a time of need. And Ukraine has been a similar circumstance in that the U.S. is not directly involved, but has instead sought to support Ukraine indirectly in ways that do not provoke Russia into a direct conflict. And so I think there's a sense then for the general public that this could occur potentially with a China-Taiwan conflict. And for policymakers, I think then there's also a greater concern in that they were already aware of these nuances that took place in the background.
Brian, I know you're fairly busy. I got two more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about the issue regarding going back to younger generations. Again, you started this internet online magazine. It's called A New Bloom. And can you help us to understand what messages are you trying to send out to the younger generation, especially the readers across the continent or even across the world? And that's number one. And number two, how important it is for everyone, not just in Taiwan, but look beyond Taiwan, to understand such political and social movement happening in this part of the world today.
So I think particularly for New Bloom, the attempt was to connect Taiwanese voices with the international world because we felt a lot with the news coverage of the Sun Department where that there was not any news coverage. The voice of Taiwanese are themselves not heard in this tension between the U.S. and China. Taiwan is more often spoken of rather than hearing the voice of Taiwanese themselves. And even with the Ukraine conflict, one observes similarly. Ukraine is talked about in terms of U.S. interests, in Russian interests, etc., but sometimes not Ukrainians themselves. And so we want to have a platform to really connect them with the international world, to allow Taiwanese voices to be heard. And that's what the point of founding this and eventually shifting to majority English content was about. But then I think in terms of young people across the world, young people are facing adverse conditions. We see war, military dictatorships, particularly in Asia. We've seen the rise of the Milk Tea Alliance or movements in Thailand, Myanmar, the Philippines, and beyond. And I just think globally, we've saw the rise of movements of young people struggling against economic inequality, that young people do not have the conditions that their parents had, and so really struggle to make it and have the same standard of living that their parents had, or that conditions just deteriorate. And this is reflected even in U.S. domestic politics. And so we were really hoping to connect with Taiwan and those places, to connect young people across the world or people with like-minded values through this publication. And so that's what we're aiming for. And so 7-8 years later, close to 8 years later, that's what we're still trying to do, and trying to conduct dialogues online through physically through our space that we run in Taipei and other endeavors to really build this space for discussion and thought and reflection on the shared condition. Because I do think that we're all caught up together in terms of the world and society and so forth.
Brian, the last question, I want to end our conversation on climate change. And you know, for mainland China, and especially for the entire world, that climate change or renewable energy, this is something that the world is watching today. And again, we always say cannot be done by one country, and let alone being can be solved by individual. Now, in terms of such heavy topic or such a critical issue, how do you think that Taiwan plays such a role in terms of dealing with climate change, or even participation with other countries in the world to tackle this critical issue?
So I think it's another part in which how global communities are all connected. Because if one country does not follow these global standards, then well, the rest of the world is still doomed to climate change. And so this includes Taiwan. Taiwan historically has been a polluter. The industrial buildup of Taiwan under the Chiang administrations, the two dictatorships, were through massive pollution of the environment. Taiwan is still reckoning with this decades later. And so after that, the democracy movement was very much tied up with the environmental movement because there was a sense of this environmental destruction that had been wreaked on Taiwan's natural habitats, that the KMT had just really exploited Taiwan's natural resources instead of trying to preserve them to try to get back to China because that was their main endeavor rather than staying here. And so I think this has translated into the sense of that democracy and environmental protection are deeply linked. But Taiwan is left out of international climate change bodies, left out of most international bodies. And so compliance by Taiwan in these standards has sometimes been voluntary. The notion to show to the world that by being a good citizen, Taiwan also deserves a seat at the table. But then that raises the question of how to enforce this. There are companies that do find ways to skirt these rules or to exploit these older ties.
Right.
And so then there's that. But then I think in terms of the ability to influence China, I think then that's another question entirely because China perhaps will have no interest in complying about this. And so it's another way in which I think the global community, in terms of the fight against climate change, it really does have to be international.
Well, Brian Hioe is one of the founding editors of New Bloom, and he's a freelance journalist as well as a translator. Again, ladies and gentlemen, New Bloom is an online magazine covering activism and youth politics in Taiwan and Asia Pacific. And it was founded in Taiwan in 2014 in the wake of the Sunflower Movement. Brian, thank you so much for taking your time to be on our show. Again, we really appreciate that you're reporting all the way from Taiwan and help us to understand not only the logistic part regarding mainland China and Taiwan, but also how the Taiwanese younger generations today are using their power and their effort try to change not only domestically, but international policies. Thank you, Brian. It's been a pleasure of talking to you.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much.